Peace be with you. Well, friends, on this 10th of November, as the year is coming to a close, as the days are getting shorter, leaves are falling from the trees, the skies are grayer, so the church year mimics the year of nature. We're coming to the end of the church year, the liturgical year, and so our readings are taking on increasingly a dark, brooding, and foreboding quality. All the readings today are about the end of the world, about the last things. What happens when the light finally goes out on this world? It's very important the church insists every year that we look hard at these difficult realities. The first reading I want to look at is actually our second reading for the Mass today. It's the earliest Christian writing we have. The first letter that Paul wrote to the Christians of the Thessalonians. This comes from maybe the early years of the 50s of the first century, so long before any of the Gospels were written. It's the first of Paul's letters. And what we find is that from these very early days, Christians were concerned with this question of the end. Listen to Paul. We do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, about those who have fallen asleep, so that you may not grieve like the rest who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose, so too will God, through Jesus, bring with him those who have fallen asleep. What happens at the end? What happens at death? What happens after death? The very first Christians from the earliest days were profoundly concerned with these questions. What Paul states here is the ground, to use the technical term now, of our eschatological hope. The ground for our hope that God's love will carry us through this terrible experience of death and carry us through to deeper life. We believe that Jesus died and rose. So too will God, through Jesus, bring with him those who have fallen asleep. It struck the first Christians, Paul especially, that the resurrection of Jesus from the dead had changed everything. It had reversed the cosmic process that seemed to move inexorably toward death. Now, in this great case, death had been trumped. Death had been turned back. Now someone who had died had come back to life, indeed had passed into the fullness of life. It's because of that hope, because of that fact, that we all hope to live beyond death. Now listen to Paul as he gets a little bit more specific about all of this. For the Lord himself, with a word of command, with the voice of an archangel, with the trumpet of God, will come down from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds, and meet the Lord in the air. Thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore console one another with these words. Now these are much commented upon words. In the course of the Christian centuries, many theologians and spiritual writers and mystics have puzzled over these words. Today they're inspiring an enormous interest. I've spoken to you before about the Left Behind series, that series of books about the end of the world, about the rapture, that Christ will come and take his followers into heaven with him, and thus inaugurating the end of the world. What do we make of this? Well, it's always concerned me that if these readings are simply descriptive of what will in fact happen at that precise moment of the end of time, then for 99.5% of Christians who've read this passage over the centuries, they basically mean nothing. If they're simply about that particular event, when the world as a whole comes to a close, cosmically, then those of us who don't live at that time, well, we basically get nothing from these readings. I think that goes against the instinct of the church that says, no, these are for all Christians of all time. In fact, every generation should read these words and gain from them, learn from them. So how do we make sense of it? Let's face something. For everybody listening to me, let's say for everybody now, within the next 90 years, everyone is going to experience what Paul is talking about. For everybody hearing me within the next, let's say, 90 years, the world as you know it is going to end. The lights will go out. The trees, the sky, the birds, your friends, the beauties and joys of this world will be erased. Everything will come to a close. Of course, what I'm talking about is the fact of death. The fact of your death and mine. When will the world as a whole end? Well, I don't know. Jesus said, not even the Son knows, only the Father knows. I think it's idle for us to speculate excessively about that. But we all know that our world, as far as we're concerned, will come to an end. We will all face this eschatological moment. And so what do we do? I think these readings, this one from Paul and the Gospel, which I'll speak of in a second, are first of all compelling us to look. They're compelling us to see this fact. Blaise Pascal, I've spoken of him before, 17th century Catholic philosopher, theologian. He said, most of us spend most of our time diverting ourselves from this great question. Our sports, our games, our business, our interests, the things that we do for fun, for the most part, Pascal says, they are diversions from this question, this fact. We know we're going to die. We have to face this, but we don't want to face it. It's the most unpleasant of questions. And so we do this and we do that. We look here, we look there. We spend most of our time diverting ourselves from it. For Pascal, of course, who died at the age of 39, died quite young, looking at this question is indispensable. You'll also find it in the rule of St. Benedict, in some ways the founding document of Western monasticism. St. Benedict says to his monks, hold before your mind's eye every day your own death. There was a custom throughout the Middle Ages. It lasted up until relatively modern times. In certain Benedictine communities, that the monks were encouraged to dig a shovel of their own grave every day. Is it morbid? Well, it's not really morbid. It's looking seriously and honestly at this question. You know, speaking of this, last summer, I spent a few days at Gethsemane Abbey, Gethsemane Monastery in Kentucky. That's where Thomas Merton was a monk for many years, probably the greatest spiritual writer of the 20th century, and a hero of mine. And the room I was in looked right out over Merton's grave. He's buried with his brother monks right next to the church. And it was a wonderful meditation for me every day to look out at the grave of Merton. Morbid fascination? No. I think it's an honest Christian attempt to say, yes, this is a fact that we have to deal with. We have to look at it. You know, the Rosary Prayer, I know a lot of you pray the Rosary. The Rosary is what the spiritual masters call a memento mori, a reminder of death. At the close of every Hail Mary, we say, now and at the hour of our death, Amen. Now and at the hour of our death, Amen. If you pray the regular Rosary, 5 decades, 50 times a day, you remind yourself of your own death. You anticipate it, not morbidly, but honestly. You look to it, and you pray for courage and grace at that hour. All of this, I think, is being signaled very clearly in the gospel for today. We're in that wonderful section of Matthew, chapter 25. All kinds of famous parables and stories. This is the parable of the 5 wise and the 5 foolish virgins. Remember the story? The kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones, when taking their lamps, brought no oil with them, but the wise brought flasks of oil with their lamps. Since the bridegroom was long delayed, they all became drowsy and fell asleep. Well, it's a scene taken from the ordinary life of Jesus' time, these wedding celebrations that went on for many days. At this one point, we call them the bridesmaids, had the task of escorting the groom to the celebration. But they had to wait for him. So here they are waiting for the groom to come. Well, some have their lamps ready. They have oil in their lamps. Others do not. So that if and when the groom comes at night, some will be ready to accompany him, others will not. Well, of course, the analogy is clear. Jesus is the bridegroom. The church is the bride. We are waiting so he might draw us into the great celebration of heaven. When will this happen? At our death. That's when the bridegroom will come for each one of us. What's our task? To be vigilant and to be ready. Not diverted into drowsiness, not diverted into unpreparedness, but to be watching, vigilant, ready. When will he come? I don't know. You don't know. I could die today. I could die in 45 years. I could die in 20 years. I don't know. But the key is to be ready so that when he comes, I'm prepared. What does it mean, Christians, concretely, to have oil in our lamps? What does it mean concretely to be ready, to be looking honestly at the fact of our own death at the end of the world? Can I give you a few recommendations? I think, first of all, it means to be a person of steady and regular prayer. Stay in contact with God. Don't allow your relationship with the Lord to fall into disrepair. Contemplate the things of God on a regular basis. Look into the eternity of God, even as you live within time and space. That's what prayer is, taking the time to look honestly and deeply. Second recommendation, a way of keeping the lamp filled, stay close to the sacrament of reconciliation, confession. Not obsessively, not in a scrupulous way, but regularly, to bring your sins before the Lord and seek his forgiveness. Don't wait until the last second, the last minute, but be a regular participant in this sacrament of confession, forgiveness. Third recommendation, a way of keeping the oil in the lamp, don't let grudges and resentments fester. Christians, keep your relationships, especially the deep and important ones, in good repair. You've got a grudge, a hatred, a lack of forgiveness. Well, deal with that. How many people on their deathbed, how many people as the end is coming close, deeply regret the fact that they let so many relationships fall? Keep them in good shape. Just the last one in these last few seconds. Like a good Benedictine, keep a memento mori close at hand. I mean some concrete reminder of your own death. A symbol, a picture, whatever it is, but remind yourself every day that you are going to die. In this way, we keep ourselves vigilant, prepared, oil in the lamps, ready for the Lord when he comes. God bless. Peace be with you. Friends, I just finished reading a wonderful book, David McCullough's biography of John Adams, our second president. The book is, it's 600 pages or so, but it reads like a novel. Now, this is not just a paid commercial for David McCullough's book. It has something to do with the gospel, I think. McCullough is trying to find what it is about John Adams that makes him a great person. Adams certainly was a man of terrific intelligence, of vivacity. He had a wonderful circle of friends, had a terrific influence, obviously. But what McCullough puts his finger on is Adams' capacity to take risks. Call it courage if you want. But at certain key moments in his life, Adams was able to take a risk. And because of those risks, our country emerged. Let me give you just a couple of examples of this. Back in 1775, 1776, there was certainly a consensus in the colonies that they were being taken advantage of by Great Britain. There was an anger, certainly, over all kinds of economic and political matters. But there was by no means a consensus that revolution, independence, war were the route to go. John Adams sets off in 1776 to join the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. It dawns on him with a great clarity that independence was what the colonies needed. And Adams, almost by sheer force of personality, by his power of persuasion, by his lively mind, begins to convince other members of the Congress that independence is what they need. Throughout that hot summer of 1776, Adams cajoled and argued and manipulated and twisted arms and finally brought them around with the help of Jefferson and Franklin and others. But largely it was Adams who brought them around to accepting independence. Then came the risk. Adams, and with him these other members of the Congress, affixed their names to the Declaration of Independence. Now, we look back after more than 200 years, and we see this event as wonderful and monumental, and we see these figures almost as like wax figures in a museum. But think of the time. They knew when they were affixing their names to that document, they were signing, in a certain sense, their death warrant. It was by no means guaranteed that America would win the war. They were up against the most powerful military force on the planet. And if these men were tracked down, they would be hanged. And there was John Adams, willing to take that enormous risk. And because of it, the country came into existence. 2 years later, 1778, the war is not going well. Remember, Valley Forge was the winter of 77, 78. It's not going well, and Adams is asked by the Continental Congress to go over to France as a representative of the young country. Now, traveling anywhere in the 18th century, traveling by land was a dicey business. But traveling by sea was something you did only in dire necessity. It was that dangerous. Captains wanted to sail only during the summer or maybe the early fall when weather was pretty good. They never sailed in the winter or the early spring. That's when Adams had to go over to France. And it wasn't just the weather. The Atlantic Ocean was filled with hostile shipping. America's at war with England. It's filled with English shipping. If Adams had been captured, he would certainly have been hanged. But he knew in 1778 that the relationship with France was vital for the success of this young country. And so he risked, off he went on this journey. One of the best parts of McCullough's book is his description of this journey across the Atlantic in 1778. Adams went, by the way, with his young son, John Quincy, who was no more than 12. They faced all the weather they were afraid of facing, storms and gales and waves. At one point, a lightning strike even knocked the mast out of commission. There's a terrific scene in the book where the storm is so bad that Adams and his son are below deck and they're just hanging on to each other for dear life. They also faced the hostile shipping they were afraid of. They were accosted by a British ship and they had to fight it out. Well, Adams eventually made it to France and played his vital role in establishing diplomatic relations. If he had not taken that risk in 1778, this vital chapter never would have been written. There's a last one I want to tell you about, which is also a wonderful story. Young John Quincy Adams came over with him, as I mentioned, when he was 12. And he begins his education in France. He's a brilliant kid and eventually becomes very fluent in French. So a few years later, the Congress decides we have to send an embassy over to Russia. We want to get some economic or political aid from Russia. The language of the Russian court was French. No one in the American delegation spoke French well enough to deal with it. So John Adams approaches his little son, And he says, you must go on this arduous journey, so not cross land, but still an arduous journey to Moscow, and negotiate with the Tsarina. The child is 14 years old at the time. Now what I love is Adams approaches his son and he says, I know this is difficult. I'm asking you to perform a very serious and very dangerous mission on behalf of the country. But the country needs you. And so though it was breaking his own heart, and this comes through in his letters back home to his wife, it was breaking his heart to send his little 14-year-old son on this arduous journey to Russia. But the country needs you to take the risk. I think what Mccullough argues is, this is why Adams was such a great figure. You know what's intriguing to me? We look back at the Founding Fathers and we see them almost as inevitable, these great museum figures. But at the time, they were seen as kind of hotheads. Most Americans weren't in favor of rebellion against Great Britain. But because people like Adams, like Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, Washington, because they were willing to live risky lives, looking into a future that they could not clearly see, our country came into existence. Now, why am I telling you all these stories? Just to stir up your patriotic fervor? No, that's not it. Though we're not too far after the 4th of July. I tell them because this theme of risky behavior, taking a chance, leaping boldly into a future that we do not clearly see, is a very powerful biblical theme. And really, it's what the readings this week are talking about. Listen to this very beginning of the letter to the Hebrews. Brothers and sisters, faith is the realization of what is hoped for, and evidence of things not seen. Faith. Faith is not just an assent of the mind. You know, we can think of it that way very intellectually. I make an act of faith. I believe certain things. That's part of it. But in the Bible, faith means a whole attitude of life. Listen again. The realization of what is hoped for. The evidence of things not seen. And now the example of faith. Again from the letter to the Hebrews. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. He went out, not knowing where he was to go. Christians, whenever the Bible talks about Abraham, it's talking about faith. Abraham is our father in faith. He's the one who exemplifies what it means to be a person of faith. At the age of 75, he's called by God to go in search of a promised land he knew nothing about. Now, mind you, 75, he's an old man at the end of his life, settled with his family, his friends around him, in the city he knows. What does God want? I want you to get up, Abraham, and go in search of a land that I will show you. You know nothing about it. You know nothing of the dangers you will face. You know nothing of the people you might encounter. But get up now and go. Whenever I meditate on the Abraham story, I always think of the most dramatic example in my own life of getting up and going to a place I didn't know much about. And that was when I was 29, and under conditions much more benign than those that faced John Adams. I had to cross the Atlantic Ocean, this time by airplane, and I landed in Paris, where I commenced my studies. But getting off that plane in Paris, having left behind everyone I knew, every place I knew, having left behind my own language, and having to face this new world, having to face a dark future I could not see. Now, knowing fully well I'd go back on a plane in a few months on vacation, I'd be home in the summertime and all of that, but still, how perilous that was. Now, think of Abraham. 75, not 29, the end of his life, and having no idea what the future held. To leap and to go and to risk, even in that situation, under the command of God. That's faith. Notice, Christians, read the entire Scripture under this rubric. I think you'll find that these adventures, these risks, are every place. When does Israel tend to go wrong in the Old Testament? It tends to go wrong when it sits still. Israel is an Exodus people. Israel is a people on the go, on the move, under the direction of God. But when they decide, we will sit still, we will seek safety, security, we will rest in our own accomplishments, it's then that Israel goes bad. But when they are a kind of pilgrim people, on the go, on the move, under the direction of God, accepting it in faith, that they flourish. Not just an assent of the mind, but a whole attitude of the heart and the body and the soul. A riskiness, a courage. That's what faith is. All the risks we face in life, all the acts of faith, what are they preparations for? The ultimate adventure, the ultimate journey, the ultimate transition. I'm talking about the transition through the darkness of death to new life. Let's face it, Christians, in the grand scheme of things, none of us knows our future. First of all, in the ordinary sense, I don't know what's going to happen to me next week, but the great darkness that confronts me and you and everybody else is the darkness that lies through and beyond death. And we all know, whether we like it or not, that that's where we are heading. Whatever other turns the adventure of life takes, we know that it ends up at a place where we must go into a future that we do not see. What is faith throughout our lives but a kind of preparation for, or better, a kind of practicing for, the great leap we will take into the darkness of death? Now, why do we take it? Why do we take any of these leaps? Why don't we just sit still, rest comfortably in what we have? Because we have a God who wants us fully alive. The only way into that life is to let go of what we've got and trusting in God's providence, leap into His loving arms. Do we see it? No. By definition, we don't see. And yet, we trust. To be a person of faith, that's the whole of the gospel message. God bless. Peace be with you. Friends, we find ourselves today in the middle of the 13th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. The 13th chapter is a treasure trove of parables, Jesus' preferred method of teaching. When he wanted to communicate what this new reign of God was about, this kingdom, he didn't engage so much in philosophical discourse, but he told stories, shared images, gave them pictures. What is it about parables that's so powerful? Well, I think it's because symbols and images and pictures are multivalent. I mean, they have all kinds of different levels of meaning. They keep generating new meanings over time. If you say something very directly, in straight prosaic language, well, it tends to mean one thing. But when you give a picture, you tell a story, it tends to open itself up continually. So this mysterious kingdom of God is likened to various things. These are the parables. I want to pick just one from the little cluster of stories Jesus tells in today's gospel. A parable that is, I think, at the same time, one of the most puzzling, theologically deep, and practically helpful of Jesus' parables. I'm talking about the story of the wheat and the tares, or the wheat and the weeds. Remember how it begins. The Lord says, "The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a man who sowed good seed in his field. While everyone was asleep, his enemy came and sowed weeds all through the wheat, and then went off." Let me just stop there to make some comments. A basic biblical motif is that the spiritual life is a struggle. God is sowing his good seed all the time in a million different ways for his purposes. His love, his compassion, his wisdom. God is always about the work of sowing his good seed in us, in the world. But what do we find? We find from the first page of Genesis to almost the last page of Revelation that God's ways are opposed. There's a struggle going on. The Spirit of God in Genesis hovered over the surface of the chaotic waters. The waters of chaos stand there for all those forces of hatred, violence, selfishness that oppose God's ways. The waters of the Red Sea symbolize the same thing as they block the progress of the people of Israel. Jesus on the stormy waters, same symbol. God's ways are opposed by the ways of evil. So in this parable, God sows his good seed and the wheat grows. But then an enemy is identified as the one who sows among the wheat these tares or these weeds that grow up right with the wheat, in fact, right around the wheat, winding themselves around the good plant. What does this tell us? It tells us that evil, by its very nature, tends to be parasitic upon the good. What do I mean? Well, in classical theology, we speak of evil as a privation of the good. Think for a second of blindness. What's evil about blindness? Well, it's the lack of sight that ought to be there. Blindness, as it were, is a parasite on a good eye. It's a cavity or a lack in the good eye. What's sin but a perversion of what's basically good? A mind, a will, a spirit, an imagination, a body. But sin is a kind of twisting or deformation of these basically good things. The point is, evil is always in, on, and around the good. And see, Christians, this is what makes it so difficult. It's very rare that evil just sets itself up very clearly and distinctly on one side. The good is set up clearly and distinctly on the other side. So I see the one, I see the other. More often than not, as Jesus explains now in this parable, more often than not, good and evil are intertwined. One in the other, one on top of the other. What's the result of this? It is very difficult, to identify sometimes what's evil, and especially difficult to extricate evil from good without doing more damage. A couple of examples. If we're real honest with ourselves, we look at our own motives. What do we find? Well, they're often good. We want good things for the right reasons. Selflessly, out of concern for others. But look, if we keep analyzing our motives with great honesty, we will undoubtedly find that intertwined with these good motives are always less than praiseworthy motives. Around our selflessness, we can almost always find some little bit of selfishness. Around our other orientation, we can usually find some bit of self-interest. Our motives are mixed, one intertwined with the other. Several years ago, I was at a workshop, and the facilitator of the workshop said, I want you all to take a piece of paper and write down your 5 best qualities. The 5 things about yourself you think are the best. So we all did. We wrote them down. Then he said, I want you now to recognize the fact that all 5 of those are also your worst qualities. Of course, at first it's kind of puzzling, but the more you think about it, the more you see that he's right. Let's say you put down that, intelligence, that's one of my best qualities. I'm a bright person. Well, that always carries a shadow, because if you emphasize intelligence, you might be underemphasizing emotion. Let's say you say, I'm a people person. I'm very good with people. Well, that probably has a shadow that you're not very good at introspection. You're not very good at spending time with yourself. Whatever we have that's good also bears this shadow of evil, as though it's right with it, right on top of it, unavoidably. Think of any institution, any corporation, any church that survived and has done good service. Well, those things they're all good, obviously. They all have good qualities, probably good leadership, dedicated people, a clear sense of mission. But don't we all know, especially during this time, that all institutions, the church included, bear within them a kind of shadow. All institutions are also characterized by corruption, by selfishness, by desire to protect themselves. Where do you find this? Well, not clearly off on one side, but often right on top of, intertwined with, all that makes the institution or corporation or church good. The wheat and the tares, one with the other. So, what's the upshot of all this? Well, let's go on with the parable. The man's slaves said to him, do you want us to go and pull them up? He replied, no. If you pull up the weeds, you might uproot the wheat along with them. This, I think, is an extremely important and extremely difficult principle to come to grips with. Whenever we see evil, we naturally have a sort of crusading attitude. I want to do something about that. I want to extricate it. Get rid of it. There's corruption in myself, corruption in my church, in my company, in my family. I will root it out. And so, like a great crusader, I go. What's the danger? If I'm not sensitive to the fact that good and evil are so tightly intertwined, in the very act of trying to extricate the evil, I can uproot and destroy what is good. There's some evils that have to be approached with extreme delicacy. Here's an image that comes to my mind. It's like Jesus' parable. There's a man I knew who had a lung tumor that grew in such a way that it actually had wrapped itself right around part of the heart. When the surgeons saw this, they knew they had to go in with extreme delicacy. Obviously, if they just hack out the tumor, they would damage the heart. It took a surgeon's fine, delicate touch to perform that operation. So often with evils in ourselves, in our society, in our church, we need a very patient and delicate touch. In fact, sometimes, in some ways, it's simply better to leave that work to God. That's why I say this parable is so practically important for us. I think it checks us in those moments when we are so enthusiastic to get rid of the evil that we just go at it with a blunt instrument. Sometimes the best thing to do is to let God take care of it. There's a kind of bracing realism here, I think, in this story that's important for us. Just a last reflection on it. Another great and puzzling truth that emerges from this parable is that mysterium iniquitatis, the mystery of evil. So God sows his good seed, the wheat comes up, and an enemy sows weeds, and they threaten the wheat. Well, look, isn't God the Lord of his whole creation? Yes. Therefore, if the seeds of evil are sown, isn't it to some degree God's permission that they be sown? Well, yes, is the answer of our great tradition. Yes, at least in God's permissive will, evil is flowing from his own providence. Christians, are there some goods, now listen, are there some goods that flourish only in and with and indeed because of certain evils? Aquinas says God permits certain evils to bring out of them a greater good. Is it possible that, were it not for the struggle with evil, certain goods in ourselves, in our society, in our church would not exist? Years ago in my pastoral ministry, I knew a young woman about 7 or 8 years old, and she was profoundly handicapped, both physically and intellectually. Her family brought her to church every week, and there she'd be in the first pew, and she was kind of locked into her wheelchair. And it was so obvious that she was in terrible straits. Her grandmother would bring her some weeks, other weeks her parents, some weeks her siblings, her brothers and sisters. What I found so beautiful and so edifying is week after week I saw this young woman in all her suffering and her family, that her family was undoubtedly in powerful ways shaped by the experience of loving and caring for this young girl. That their compassion, their love, their other orientation was undoubtedly stirred up precisely by the fact that they were obliged in love to care for this sister and for this daughter. Christians, are there some evils that wind around the good in such a way as to enhance the good? Perhaps sometimes our job is not to root it out immediately, get rid of it, because in the process we'll do more damage. But perhaps sometimes in the face of evil, the best thing to do is in prayer and in patience, let the delicate hands of God do their work. God bless. Peace be with you. Friends, our readings today are interesting ones. They're strange and puzzling. They have to do, I think, with the Christian attitude toward the body. It's a theme we probably don't talk about enough, but it is all through the Bible. And the readings today are especially good, I think, at naming this very distinctive biblical understanding of the body. I think the biblical position is really midway between, or if you will, beyond, two great extremes. The one extreme is called hedonism, or materialism, the view that the body and its pleasures are everything. They're the ultimate horizon of my life, that I give pleasure to my body, that I cherish my body, I cling to its values, and so on. That's hedonism, materialism. The other extreme, and you'll find it all over the history of religion and philosophy, the other extreme is a kind of dualism or puritanism that basically says the body is a problem. The real spiritual importance is found in the soul or in the mind. And the body is a bit like a prison, or it's an obstacle to spiritual progress. You'll find this in Plato, you'll find it in the Manichaeans, you'll find it in all forms of Puritanism. And I bet we can each recognize these extremes in ourselves. Often as we move through our spiritual lives, we go back and forth between these two extremes. Sometimes I'm very hedonistic, very materialistic, very focused on my body. Other times I'm kind of ashamed of it, or I wish it would go away, or I'm trying to escape from it. The biblical view is neither hedonistic nor puritanical. It's a stance of what I'm going to call eschatological detachment. And I'll try to explain what I mean in terms of these two readings. Our first reading is taken from the second book of Maccabees. I've often recommended to people just starting with Bible study, read the books of the Maccabees. They're very adventurous, very entertaining. They deal with the period when Palestine was occupied by Greeks, and the Greeks were imposing their religion, their culture, their practices on the Jews. This, of course, did not sit well with the Jews, and they organized rebellions against the Greeks. The rebellions were led by the Maccabees, and so the books detail that period. What we find, of course, during the occupation are what we find during all oppressive occupations. the people being forced to do things against their will, stories of cowardice, and stories of great courage. Our reading for today is from 2 Maccabees, and it's the most dramatic account, I think, of this courageous resistance to the Greeks. Listen a little bit to this story. It happened that 7 brothers with their mother were arrested and tortured with whips and scourges by the king to force them to eat pork in violation of God's law. One of the brothers, speaking for the others, said, "What do you expect to achieve by questioning us? We are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our ancestors." Well, there it is, the 7 brothers. Tragically now, they're arrested, and in the presence of their mother, one by one, they are tortured to force them to eat pork. But they don't give in. And one by one, these 7 brothers are killed. And then finally, the mother herself is killed. And the story goes on to recount their kind of defiant, heroic speeches in the face of their oppressors. Now, what do we derive from this story? Well, first of all, it becomes very clear that for biblical people, materialism and hedonism is not the right attitude toward the body. If these people felt for 1 minute that the body and its pleasures and its goods were the ultimate value, well, this makes no sense. This makes no sense. I mean, you go along with your oppressors at least to save your own life. But these heroic martyrs are willing to hand over their bodies to be tortured and killed. That means they are not clinging to their bodies as the ultimate value. Think of the whole history of martyrdom, now up and down the biblical tradition and into the Christian tradition. Martyrs make sense from Stephen to Maximilian Kolbe only if this principle is true, that the body is not everything. Remember Jesus' line? Don't be afraid of those who can kill the body and do nothing else. I've always felt that last line is the key to it. Don't be afraid of those who can kill the body and do nothing else. In other words, the death of the body is not everything. There is a dimension of life beyond it, and therefore we don't cling to it. Okay, so you say that's pretty clear. Christians are not hedonists. They're not materialists. But how do we know this is not just dualism or Platonism? Let's just escape from the body. Well, listen to the tone of what these martyrs say in the book of Maccabees. One of the brothers says, as he holds his hands out, as the torturer is going to cut his hands off, he says this, "It was from heaven that I received these. For the sake of his laws, I disdain them. Now listen, from him I hope to receive them again." Now we're in a very interesting world. Yes, I'm allowing you to cut off my hands. I'm allowing you to kill my body. Why now? Because God's laws are more important. Okay, the body is not everything. But then he adds, from God, I hope to receive them again. This is not a man who is longing to escape from the body. This is a man who is longing to receive his body again, but now in a transformed, transfigured way. Handing himself over, yes, in the hopes of a resurrection and a restoration of his body through the life and the grace of God. You see why I said the biblical stance is one of eschatological detachment. I mean, we can be detached from these bodies because we know that in heaven, in the next dimension, we will receive even greater, even richer, and even finer bodies. I think that's the biblical attitude. Now, you can also see it, Christians, in the gospel. And the gospel is a very interesting parallel to this story. In the gospel, Jesus confronts the Sadducees. They were a party of Jews in Jesus' time who denied the resurrection. They believed that we should be good in this life and follow God's laws, but they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. So they proposed to Jesus this little conundrum. Teacher, they said, Moses wrote for us, if someone's brother dies, leaving a wife but no child, his brother must take the wife and raise up descendants for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first married a woman, but died childless. Then the second and the third married her, and likewise all the 7 died childless. Finally, the woman also died. Now, at the resurrection, whose wife will that woman be? For all 7 had been married to her. Well, it's an interesting little conundrum, isn't it? If the brothers are all obliged to marry, to make up for their brother who had died, and now she marries a series of 7 brothers. Okay, at the resurrection, whose wife is she? Notice how Jesus deals with this little conundrum. He brushes it aside. Jesus said to them, the children of this age marry and remarry, but those who are deemed worthy to attain to the coming age neither marry nor are given in marriage. They can no longer die, for they are like angels. Now, what's he saying here as he brushes aside this little bit of casuistry? What is heaven? Is it an escape from the body? No, that's not it. That's not a biblical view. Heaven is a place, listen now, where our bodiliness will be so rich and so intense that we will be able to relate to all those around us in the most intimate, powerful, and rich way possible. The body is a kind of means of communication. Right now, I'm communicating to you through my body, through my vocal cords and my tongue and my mouth and so on. If I'm with you personally, I'll communicate with you through my hands and my physical presence. The body is a means of communication. In this world, with the limitations of this particular body that I have, I can communicate only with a few people at a time. And listen now, I can communicate at the deepest and most intense level with really only one person. That's why we talk about marriage. It's a commitment of one person to one person. It's possible given the restrictions of this world. But now, imagine what the bodily life of heaven is like. Now, Jesus is telling us, we have a body, a means of communication that is so intense and so powerful and so rich that we can be in very intense relationship with everyone who's gathered around the throne of God. It's not that we're less bodily. In a certain way, we're more bodily. We can let go of the bodiliness of this world, as did the martyrs, as did those brothers in the Maccabee story, because we hope to receive from God a bodiliness that's even more intense and more powerful. There's a movie called Black Robe that was out several years ago. There's a scene in Black Robe that I really find comical. It's these Jesuit brothers from the 17th century, and they're in among the Native Americans of Canada. And they're trying to explain the Christian faith. And according to the Native American mythology, heaven was a place of great sensual pleasure, where sex and sensual pleasure played a great role. And the Native American says to the Jesuit, now, as you look at heaven, does it have all of that in it? And the Jesuit says, oh, no, there's none of that. We're simply looking at the face of God all day. And the Native American says, well, I don't want that. I'll stay with my mythology. I remember as I watched that scene, I thought, that was a very bad answer the Jesuit gave. In other words, he was implying that heaven is somehow less than the pleasures and intensity and intimacy available to us in this world. The point of Jesus' speech here, I think, is it's not less. It's more. It's more. Whatever intimacy and pleasure and intensity we can experience here with these very limited bodies, we will experience at the highest pitch and the highest degree in the bodiliness of heaven. Eschatological detachment. Yes, we can let go of this world, of this body, in the hopes of receiving an even greater and more intense communication in heaven. You know, I think all this becomes plain in a certain way in the resurrection stories. How does Jesus appear? It is very important in all those accounts that he appears in his body. His body is not left behind. Listen now, it's transfigured, yes, transformed. What does it allow him to do? It allows him to be present when he wants, where he wants, with a terrific freedom and a terrific intimacy. Heaven is not escaping from the body. It's receiving from God an even greater and richer body. In all the creeds we say we look for the resurrection of the dead. We expect the resurrection of the body. That means our capacity for love will be that much greater, that much richer. We don't run from the body, we don't cling to the body, but we wait in eschatological hope for a new one. God bless.